The wait time for an eviction hearing at Ontario's Landlord Tenant Board is now approaching a year long, and many tenants are behind on rent or not paying at all, leaving landlords with little recourse. More on that later. Also, a big story this week, Statcan released their labor force survey for February, with employment rising by 41,000 jobs. Minister of Finance Chrystia Freeland took to Twitter to celebrate the news with this tweet. Great news this morning. Thanks to the hard work of Canadians, 41,000 new jobs were created last month, double the market expectations. That is great news, right? It's not. That's right, folks, it's time for another Friday update with your old pal MillennialMoron. I've got 5 stories for you today, but they're all short ones, and it's a mix of good and bad news this time, so it shouldn't mess up your weekend vibe that bad. As always, if you are somehow enjoying these videos, remember to like, subscribe, leave a comment, or whatever you want to do, because it really does help me out. Alternatively, if you want to do none of that and watch the videos with some kind of ad blocker on so I don't get paid for it, that's fine too. At least you're thinking about this stuff, and I appreciate you for that. First up, an update on Calgary's affordable housing strategy, which I did a video series on last year. Calgary City Council has just voted to continue on with the scheduled public hearing on citywide upzoning, rather than pushing the issue to a plebiscite at the next municipal election. For some background, last year their council approved the affordable housing plan by a vote of 12-3, but that was just to direct city administration to come up with implementation for each item, which then have to be brought back to council for individual public hearings and votes. One of the more controversial items is upzoning the base residential district in the city to RCG, meaning that things like multiplexes and row houses would be allowed everywhere by default rather than having to rezone each individual parcel of land. This is a key element of accelerating housing development in the city because it would eliminate a large amount of cost and administrative delay from building denser infill housing. The public hearing on this item was scheduled for April 22nd, but Councillor Dan McLean, who has been a vocal opponent of citywide upzoning, introduced a motion to cancel the public hearing in April and put the issue to a plebiscite vote at the next municipal election in October of 2025. This was presented by McLean as a way to ensure everyone in the city had a chance to vote on the issue, as they did with the bid for the Olympics and water fluoridation, but in my opinion, it's a pretty transparently obvious delay tactic for a couple of reasons. One, while this would push the issue to a citywide vote a year and a half after the originally scheduled public hearing, it would be non-binding and the city would still have to have a public hearing and vote on upzoning before it would be implemented anyway. And two, after the most recent plebiscite that McLean mentioned on the subject of water fluoridation, 2 city councillors still voted against the result of the plebiscite. One was Andre Chabot, who also supported delaying the upzoning vote, and the other one was Dan McLean. So you'll have to forgive me for being a bit cynical if I see this as a way to derail the process rather than a genuine interest in the will of the people. Anyway, if you're in Calgary and want to learn more about RCG and some of the common concerns around things like parking and utilities, I just had a panel discussion about it on the latest episode of my podcast, which I'll link to in the video description. Next, the Government of Canada recently released a guide to mortgage relief options for people struggling with mortgage payments. The guide covers things like how to tell if you're in negative amortization, where your interest charges are actually greater than your monthly payments, options for renegotiating your mortgage, and various mortgage features you may be able to leverage to help with payments in the short term. These options include things like re-borrowing extra payments you may have made during your mortgage term, mortgages which have an option to defer a payment to a later date, and using a home equity line of credit to borrow money against your home equity to make your mortgage payments. Now, that last one is pretty alarming to me considering I recently talked about a business that was pitching that as an option and what a ridiculously predatory lending practice it is, so it's weird to see the government now suggesting the same thing. To their credit, the page does say that doing this can put you at financial risk and explains that HELOCs are demand loans, meaning the bank can lower the amount of credit they've extended to you or ask you to repay the balance at any time. But still, it's not a great sign. Next, the backlog at Ontario's Landlord Tenant Board has continued to grow, with orders for evictions now taking an average of 342 days to process, and requests from tenants for things like maintenance orders taking an average of 427 days. This is a tenfold increase from wait times in 2018. If things keep going the way they're going, these wait times would continue to increase, as the data for 2022-23 shows over 73,000 applications being received, but only 53,000 being resolved. This is despite staffing levels at the LTB more than doubling from 53 to 128. According to Tribunal Watch Ontario, referencing a report by the Ontario Ombudsman, the reasons for the backlog include a loss of many experienced adjudicators and a transition from in-person to online hearings. The transition to digital hearings creates a lot of issues that might not be obvious at first, like a reduction in matters being resolved through pre-settlement hearings, more people showing up without representation who don't really understand the problem, and the classic 45 minutes of people struggling with, "Can you hear me? I can hear you, but I don't think you can hear me." Okay, hold on here. Can you hear me now? No? Well, I can hear you. That said, I do think there's something going on here beyond just government mismanagement. If you look at CMHC's rental market report, rent in Toronto went up by 8.7% last year, and fully 1/5 of renters are behind on payments, if they're paying at all. On top of that, the vacancy rate is only 1.5% for purpose-built rentals and 0.7% for condo rentals, so tenants have a really strong aversion to moving because it's going to be extremely hard to find a new place. Basically, what we're seeing now is a scenario that I've known for years was going to play out at some point, I just didn't know when or exactly how. With property investors taking on mountains of cheap debt to buy places that operate cash flow negative or at razor-thin margins, it was obvious that when interest rates went up, they were going to run into cash flow problems with their mortgage payments. What I didn't anticipate was that rising interest rates would coincide with incredibly low vacancy rates across the country, and because landlords currently have no need to compete with each other for tenants, they've been able to just pass those higher interest costs directly through to the tenants instead of having to sell to stop losing cash. However, tenants in Toronto are now basically playing the biggest Uno reverse card of all time and saying, oh, you can't afford your mortgage payments on your investment property? Well, guess what? Neither can we. So now they're taking advantage of a legal right they have, which inherently forms part of every landlord-tenant agreement in Ontario, which is that they can have a hearing at the Landlord Tenant Board before an eviction can legally be carried out. Personally, I strongly suspect that this is why pre-hearing settlements are way down now. People aren't trying to negotiate a real solution. They know they're going to lose at the hearing, they're just trying to drag the process out for as long as possible to avoid having to look for a new place, and to put more pressure on the landlord to back down or make them an offer to leave. And it seems to be working. There's a lot more I could say about this story, probably enough for a standalone video, particularly regarding how bad assumptions from property investors have been screwing up the market. But for now, that's the quick version. Speaking of Toronto, City Council is looking at 130 parking lots throughout the city as potential sites for housing projects, particularly those in close proximity to transit stations. Realistically, they've been talking about this for ages and still haven't really accomplished anything, but now that the housing crisis is a topic of national conversation, I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll see some actual action on it this time. Finally, we have Statcan's labor force survey showing an increase of almost 41,000 jobs for the month of February. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, our Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland celebrated this news on Twitter by declaring it to be double the market's expectations for job creation. Unfortunately, the unemployment rate still rose from 5.7 to 5.8% because the size of the labor force grew by over 76,000 people, resulting in an increase of about 35,000 in the unemployed population. In other words, even with double the amount of jobs created as expected, we're still nowhere close to absorbing the increase in the working age population. Apart from that, the breakdown in those 41,000 jobs was an increase of 19,000 public sector jobs, a decrease of 16,000 private sector jobs, and an increase of 38,000 in self-employment. So not exactly the strong economic indicators we might have been hoping for, but they are numbers. That's all for this time, so as always, thanks for watching and enjoy your weekend.